The city was quiet that night. Most of the lights in the tall buildings had gone out, and only the distant hum of traffic broke the silence. Big Shaq walked alone down a narrow street, his hood up and his hands in his jacket pockets. He had just left a long studio session, his mind still buzzing with beats and lyrics. Usually this part of town was loud and busy. Tonight it felt like the whole world was asleep. As he passed a dimly lit alley, something caught his eye. A small movement like someone shifting in the shadows. He slowed down. There, tucked against the cold brick wall, sat a man. He was wrapped in an old, torn coat, with a thin blanket pulled tightly around his shoulders. His hair was messy, his face hidden under the shadow of the street lamp. Next to him was a cardboard sign with smudged words. "Just trying to get by. Anything helps." Shaq's steps slowed even more. Something about the man felt strangely familiar, though he couldn't place why. He told himself to keep walking. People passed by the homeless every day. But as he took another step, the man lifted his head. Shaq froze. His breath caught in his chest. The man's eyes, though tired and hollow, were unmistakable. He knew those eyes. Memories crashed into him all at once. Bright classrooms, laughter, encouragement, a firm voice pushing him to keep going when he wanted to quit. This wasn't just some stranger. This was Mr. Daniels, his old high school teacher. Shaq blinked, thinking maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. Mr. Daniels had always been full of life. He had worn sharp suits, carried piles of books under his arm, and always spoke like he believed every kid could become something great. He was the one who had stopped Shaq from dropping out when the world laughed at his dreams. He was the first adult who told him, "You're meant for something big." And now here he was, alone, shivering, homeless. Shaq's heart clenched. He took a small step closer. "Mr. Daniels?" he said softly. The man looked up again, squinting. For a moment, there was no recognition in his eyes. Then they widened just a little. "Michael." His voice cracked. Dry, broken, nothing like the confident voice Shaq remembered. No one had called him by his real name in years. "Yes, it's me," Shaq whispered. Mr. Daniels tried to smile, but it came out as more of a tired twitch. "Well, look at you," he murmured. "Famous, and I'm just here." Those words cut through Shaq like glass. He didn't know what to say. He just stood there, his breath making little white clouds in the cold air. Around them, people walked past quickly, pretending not to notice. The world seemed too busy to care, but Shaq couldn't move. How could someone who had once carried so much light be left in the dark? He slowly crouched down so they were face to face. "What happened?" he asked gently. Mr. Daniels shrugged weakly. "Life," he said. "Lost my job, then my home, then everything kind of fell apart." There was no anger in his voice. No blame. Just exhaustion. Shaq's eyes stung. He had known tough times growing up. Days when meals were skipped, nights when dreams felt too heavy to carry. But this, seeing the man who once believed in him sitting forgotten on a cold sidewalk, felt like the world had turned upside down. They stayed there in silence for a moment, two lives that had once crossed in a noisy classroom now meeting again on an empty street. Shaq noticed Mr. Daniels was shaking. His hands were red from the cold. His shoes were full of holes. There was no pride left in him, only quiet survival. Shaq couldn't just walk away. He stood up slowly and said, "Wait here." Mr. Daniels gave a tired laugh. "Where else would I go?" Shaq walked to the nearby corner shop, bought a hot sandwich and a bottle of water and returned. Mr. Daniels accepted them with trembling hands and ate slowly, like someone who hadn't tasted warmth in a long time. Shaq sat next to him, silent, watching people hurry past, wondering how many times they had done the same. Inside, something shifted in him. This wasn't just about giving a meal. This was about giving back to the man who once gave him belief when he had none. As Mr. Daniels finished eating, he whispered, "I used to tell you to never give up. Funny, isn't it? I couldn't follow my own lesson." Shaq's voice was firm now, steady like it had been in the studio. "It's not over. Not for you." Mr. Daniels looked at him in surprise, as if he'd forgotten what hope even sounded like. Shaq stood and reached out his hand. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's get you out of the cold." And for the first time that night, Mr. Daniels hesitated, then slowly placed his fragile hand into Shaq's strong one. They stood together, and Shaq led him gently away from the shadows, back toward the lights. What neither of them knew was that this small moment was only the beginning, and it would soon change both of their lives forever. The streets grew brighter as they walked, yet the silence between them felt heavy, like a fragile glass that could break with one wrong word. Big Shaq kept glancing at Mr. Daniels walking beside him, almost as if he still didn't fully believe what he was seeing. This man had once stood at the front of a buzzing classroom, his voice full of energy, his eyes sharp with purpose. Now, his shoulders were slumped, his steps slow and unsure, as though each one was borrowed from fading strength. Shaq didn't speak for a while. He didn't know where to start. There were so many questions. How long had he been on the streets? Did anyone know? Was there no one to help him? But something in Mr. Daniels' face stopped him from asking. It wasn't shame exactly, it was something quieter. Like someone who had stopped expecting kindness from the world. They reached a small cafe that was still open late. The warm smell of coffee floated out as Shaq pushed the door. Inside, the air was thick with heat and the low hum of soft music. A few people glanced up, some recognizing Shaq instantly, but he didn't care. Tonight wasn't about fame. He guided Mr. Daniels to a corner booth, away from curious eyes. The older man sat stiffly as if unsure he belonged there. Shaq ordered soup, bread, and tea for him. When the hot meal arrived, Mr. Daniels wrapped his hands around the cup like it was the first real warmth he'd felt in months. He took slow sips, eyes half closed, letting the steam wash over his face. As he ate, pieces of the past began to float between them. "Do you remember," Shaq said carefully, "how you used to make us write down one dream every Friday?" Mr. Daniels paused mid-bite. A faint smile flickered across his tired face. "Yes," he said softly. "You always wrote be on stage. Every single week." Shaq chuckled under his breath. "And you always said, then practice like the world is already watching." "I did," Mr. Daniels said. His voice had a trace of pride mixed with sadness. "You actually did it? You kept going?" Shaq looked at him for a long moment. "Because you told me I could." Mr. Daniels stared down at his soup, his hands trembling slightly. The words seemed to sink deep inside him, stirring something long buried. He hadn't heard gratitude in a long time. Not real gratitude. Not from someone whose life had actually changed. He let out a slow breath, and for a moment he was no longer the broken man sitting in a cafe. He was the teacher again, the man who used to stand tall in front of a class full of restless teenagers, believing he could shape them into something better. "You were stubborn," he said quietly. "You never stopped writing lyrics in my class." Shaq grinned. "You never stopped taking them away either." They both laughed softly. The sound was small but real, like the crackle of a fire starting to catch. The cafe around them faded for a moment as they drifted back through time. Shaq remembered the dusty sunlight on the classroom floor, the sound of chalk scratching on the blackboard, the smell of old books. He remembered how he used to feel invisible to everyone, except Mr. Daniels. While others doubted him, Mr. Daniels would stay after class, reading his messy notebook pages and saying, "There's something here. Keep going." Those words had been like oxygen to a boy drowning in doubt. Now that same man sat before him with hollow cheeks and weary eyes, holding on to warmth as if it might disappear. It didn't feel fair. It didn't feel right. Shaq spoke quietly. "What happened, sir?" Mr. Daniels hesitated, then his voice broke the silence. "After my wife passed, everything fell apart. I stopped showing up the way I used to. The school let me go. I tried to find work, but grief is a heavy thing to carry. People move on. I couldn't. Bills piled up. I lost the house. And then," he made a small, helpless gesture. "This." Shaq's chest tightened. He couldn't imagine losing everything, and then being left behind by the world. He wanted to tell him that he wasn't a failure, that one mistake or tragedy didn't erase years of good. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he just listened. Really listened, the way Mr. Daniels had once done for him. When Mr. Daniels fell quiet, Shaq leaned forward. "You know," he said slowly, "back then I was one step from giving up. Everyone laughed when I said I wanted to be an artist. Everyone but you." Mr. Daniels blinked at him. "You believed in me," Shaq said, "when no one else did. And now it's my turn." Mr. Daniels swallowed hard. He looked away quickly, but not before Shaq saw the glimmer in his eyes. Not tears of shame, tears of someone who hadn't felt seen in a very long time. They sat there for a while longer, letting the warmth of the cafe soak into their bones. Slowly, the man who had been invisible on the street began to feel human again. Not a forgotten shadow. Not a broken thing. A man who had mattered and still did. Shaq knew one thing with sudden, sharp clarity. This could not be where Mr. Daniels' story ended. Not on a cold sidewalk. Not like this. And in that quiet booth, a decision began forming inside him. One that would change everything. Shaq sat in that small cafe long after most of the customers had left, The hum of conversation replaced by the soft clinking of cups being cleaned behind the counter. Mr. Daniels had stopped speaking and was staring quietly at the steam rising from his tea. The lines on his face seemed deeper now, etched not just by time but by the weight of years spent being unseen. Shaq's mind, however, was racing. He kept hearing echoes of his younger self, the boy who had walked through school corridors with holes in his shoes and big dreams in his head. The boy who would have given up if not for this man sitting before him. And now that same man had nowhere to go. The thought hit him like a punch in the chest. He knew he couldn't just leave him there. Not tonight. Not ever again. Mr. Daniels, Shaq said softly, breaking the silence, you don't have to go back out there. The older man looked up, confused. Back out? To the streets, Shaq said firmly. Not tonight. Not anymore. Mr. Daniels blinked as if the words didn't fit inside his world. Shaquille, he began gently, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I can't burden you. You've got your own life. You're not just anything, Shaq cut in. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. You're the reason I even believed in myself enough to have a life. You were there when I had nothing. Let me be here now. Mr. Daniels opened his mouth to argue, then shut it again. The fight had gone out of him long ago, replaced by the quiet acceptance of someone who had grown used to being overlooked. And maybe that was what hurt Shaq the most, seeing how easily he had accepted being invisible. Shaq reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. I'm calling a car, he said, his tone leaving no space for debate. Where would we even go? Mr. Daniels asked, as though the idea of being taken somewhere felt almost impossible. My place. For now, Shaq said simply. It's warm. It's safe. You'll get a real bed, real food, and a shower. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Mr. Daniels stared at him, stunned. His lips trembled like he wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, his eyes filled slowly with tears, not the sharp tears of shame, but the trembling kind that come when hope sneaks back into a place it had been gone from for too long. Why would you do this for me? He whispered. Shaq looked him right in the eye. Because you once did it for me. That broke something open inside the older man. He lowered his gaze, pressing a trembling hand over his mouth as his shoulders shook. It wasn't a dramatic cry but a quiet, raw release, like someone who had been holding his breath for years and had finally exhaled. When the car arrived, Shaq helped him to his feet. They walked out into the night, and for the first time Mr. Daniels didn't seem quite so small. The streetlights painted halos on the wet pavement as they climbed into the car. Shaq gave the driver his address, then sat back, glancing sideways at the man who had once taught him how to dream. Mr. Daniels stared out the window, the city lights blurring into gold streaks. He held the seatbelt strap tight, as though anchoring himself to this sudden, fragile shift in his reality. As they drove, Shaq's mind buzzed with plans. He didn't know how yet, but he would make sure Mr. Daniels got back on his feet. He had connections, resources, and influence, things his teacher had once told him to build with purpose. Maybe they could start with a doctor's checkup, new clothes, reconnecting him with old colleagues. There had to be a way. But more than logistics, what burned inside Shaq was something deeper. Responsibility. This man had once carried his hope when it was too heavy for him to hold. Now it was Shaq's turn to carry his. They pulled up to Shaq's building. The security guard's eyebrows rose when he saw them, but he said nothing, just nodded respectfully. Inside, the lobby was warm and glowing, and the marble floors gleamed under the lights. Shaq caught the way Mr. Daniels' eyes darted around, uneasy, as if stepping inside such a place felt like trespassing. In the elevator, Mr. Daniels whispered, I don't belong here. Shaq turned to him. You belong wherever you are. And right now you're here. That's enough. When they reached the apartment, Shaq opened the door to a space filled with quiet luxury, soft couches, framed awards, warm lighting. It was everything Mr. Daniels had once encouraged him to reach for, and for a moment, the man looked like he was standing inside one of his old classroom pep talks. Shaq showed him to the guest room. The bed was neatly made, and the air smelled faintly of clean linen. Mr. Daniels stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed. He reached out and touched the blanket lightly as if checking if it was real. You can rest, Shaq said gently. No one's going to move you along. No one's going to tell you to leave. Mr. Daniels turned, his eyes shining. I don't have words. You don't need words, Shaq said. Just rest. And for the first time in years, Mr. Daniels lay down on a real bed. The weight of the world seemed to fall off him as his eyes closed almost immediately. Shaq stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the man who had once stood between him and failure finally fall into peaceful sleep. In that quiet moment, Shaq silently made a promise to himself. This was not going to be charity. This was going to be redemption. Mr. Daniels had given him a future. Now Shaq would give him back his present, and maybe even his dreams. The next morning, soft sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Shaq's apartment. The city outside was just waking up, cars starting to hum, birds weaving between rooftops. Shaq was already up, sitting at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He hadn't slept much. His mind had been running all night, looping between memories of Mr. Daniels' old classroom and the broken man he had seen last night. It still didn't seem real. This was the man who had taught him how to dream, who had said, "Your words can change rooms and rooms can change worlds." And now, that same man had been living invisible, eating scraps, sleeping on cold sidewalks. Shaq knew one thing for certain. Giving him just a bed for the night wasn't enough. He needed something bigger. Something permanent. A way to rebuild the pieces of the life Mr. Daniels had lost. He pulled out a notebook and started scribbling ideas. Jobs. Therapy. Health checkups. Maybe he could reconnect Mr. Daniels with old colleagues or get him tutoring work. But it couldn't just be about money. Money would keep him alive, but it wouldn't give him back his purpose. Because purpose, that was what Mr. Daniels had always carried like fire. And when that fire had gone out, everything else had crumbled. Shaq looked up when he heard soft footsteps. Mr. Daniels appeared in the hallway, wearing the clean clothes Shaq had left out for him. They were a bit loose, but he looked different. His hair was combed back. His eyes were still tired, but they weren't as hollow. He stood straighter, as though just being under a roof had started to lift the invisible weight off his shoulders. "Good morning," Shaq said gently. Mr. Daniels gave a small nod. "Morning." Shaq slid a plate of scrambled eggs and toast across the counter. Mr. Daniels sat down slowly, like he wasn't sure he had the right to. He murmured a thank you and began to eat in quiet bites. They didn't talk much at first. The sound of clinking forks filled the air. Shaq didn't rush him. He knew rebuilding trust was like coaxing a scared bird. It had to be done softly, patiently. After a while, Shaq spoke. "You know, I was thinking," he began carefully, "we could figure out a way to get you back on your feet." Mr. Daniels froze, his fork hovering in midair. "Back on my feet?" "Yeah. Something steady. A place to stay, maybe some work. You were always good with kids. You could mentor again. Maybe even teach." The older man gave a short, hollow laugh. "Teach? No school would take me now." Shaq leaned forward. "Then we don't go to a school. We build something new." Mr. Daniels looked up, startled. "Build something? Why not?" Shaq said, eyes brightening. "A small learning center. A safe space for kids who feel invisible like I once did. You could run it. You'd be perfect." Mr. Daniels stared at him like he had just spoken another language. For a long time he didn't say anything. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I don't even have a bank account anymore." "Then we'll open one," Shaq said firmly. "I'll handle the paperwork. You just have to bring your heart." There was a silence so still it felt sacred. Mr. Daniels set down his fork and rubbed his face with both hands, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I have that heart anymore," he whispered. Shaq's voice softened. "It's still there. I saw it last night. I see it now. You just need someone to remind you." Tears welled in the older man's eyes. He blinked quickly, trying to hide them, but Shaq pretended not to notice. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket. "We'll start simple," he said. "Step 1, doctor's appointment. You need a health check. Step 2, clean clothes and a haircut. Step 3, talk to my foundation manager about funding space for a youth center." Mr. Daniels shook his head in disbelief. "You're serious?" "I've never been more serious," Shaq said. "You once told me, never laugh at a dream that hasn't been born yet. So don't laugh at this one." Something shifted in the air at those words. A flicker lit inside Mr. Daniels' eyes, faint but real, like an old engine coughing back to life after years of silence. He looked down at his trembling hands. "I don't know how to be that man anymore." Shaq gave him a small smile. "You don't have to be him yet. You just have to take the first step." After breakfast, they made a list together on a sheet of paper. It felt surreal. Two people from opposite worlds planning how to stitch a life back together. Mr. Daniels wrote slowly, carefully, like each word might break. But by the time they finished, there was something new in the air. Possibility. That afternoon, Shaq called his foundation's director. He explained the situation, not as a charity case but as an investment in someone who had shaped him. The director promised to look into spaces they could renovate into a small youth learning hub. Meanwhile, Shaq booked a doctor, a counselor, and even called a friend who owned a clothing boutique to arrange a few sets of professional clothes. Every call was a threat. Every plan a brick. Slowly, a vision began to rise where hopelessness had lived. That night, when Shaq checked on him, Mr. Daniels was sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights. He didn't look lost this time. Just quiet. Thoughtful. Big dreams, small steps, Shaq said softly from the doorway. Mr. Daniels nodded slowly. One step at a time. It wasn't just a plan anymore. It was the beginning of a return, not just to shelter but to dignity, to purpose, to life. The following days unfolded like the slow turning of a rusty lock, stiff at first, then gradually smoother with each click of effort. Mr. Daniels moved through Shaq's apartment like someone walking on borrowed ground, still hesitant, still unsure if he belonged there. But Shaq never treated him like a guest. He treated him like family. Every morning Shaq would knock gently on the guest room door and say, "Breakfast is ready." At first, Mr. Daniels would answer softly, "Just tea is fine." But gradually he began sitting at the table, joining Shaq over toast, eggs, and quiet conversation. And with each small routine, something old and familiar began to flicker behind his tired eyes. The first real step came on a gray Wednesday. Shaq drove him to a clinic for a full health checkup. As they sat in the waiting room, Mr. Daniels fidgeted with the cuffs of his sleeves, glancing nervously at the well-dressed people around him. He looked like he wanted to disappear. Shaq leaned over. "Hey, you belong here," he whispered. "You've always belonged anywhere you choose to be." Mr. Daniels gave him a faint, shaky smile. It was the first time Shaq saw a trace of his old confidence peeking through. The tests revealed what Shaq had feared. Mr. Daniels was malnourished, exhausted, and suffering from untreated stress. But there was nothing permanent. Nothing that couldn't be rebuilt. The doctor prescribed vitamins, rest, and therapy sessions to untangle the silent grief that had been strangling him for years. On the way home, they stopped by a small clothing boutique owned by one of Shaq's friends. At first, Mr. Daniels refused. "I don't need new clothes," he muttered. "These are fine." Shaq shook his head. "You wore those in the rain. They're falling apart. We're not buying clothes, we're putting armor back on." So they stepped inside. The boutique was warm, lined with soft lights and racks of sharp suits and crisp shirts. Mr. Daniels stood frozen, staring at everything like it belonged to another world. The tailor approached gently and Shaq explained. They measured him carefully, not rushing, treating him with the same respect they would give any wealthy client. When Mr. Daniels tried on the first suit, a navy blue jacket, smooth and clean, he stood in front of the mirror like he didn't recognize the man staring back. His shoulders seemed straighter, his chin a little higher. "You look like you," Shaq said softly behind him. Mr. Daniels swallowed hard. I had forgotten what that looked like. The transformation was slow but powerful. Over the next week, Shaq arranged counseling sessions, helped him open a new bank account, and got his identification paperwork sorted. These were small things to most people, but for someone who had been erased by the world, they were like reclaiming pieces of his name. But the most important change wasn't in paperwork or clothing. It was in how Mr. Daniels began to carry himself. He started sitting on the balcony each morning, notebook in hand, writing ideas for the youth center they had dreamed up. His handwriting was shaky at first, but it steadied with each page. One evening he showed Shaq the rough outline: free tutoring for struggling kids, creative writing workshops, emotional support circles. It was exactly the kind of place Shaq had needed when he was young and lost. "You're building a home for lost kids," Shaq said, his voice thick. "Like you once built for me." Mr. Daniels blinked at him, eyes bright. "I just want to give them something to hold on to before the world convinces them they're nothing." Shaq nodded. "Then we'll build it." They started scouting possible spaces through Shaq's foundation. Most places were too expensive or too run down, but Shaq didn't mind. He knew that real things took time. And he could see something had shifted in Mr. Daniels. The man who had walked like a shadow was walking taller now. Not fast yet, but steady. Like he had remembered what his legs were for. One evening, Shaq brought him along to a community event. It was a youth talent showcase in a crowded gym, full of teenagers reciting poems and singing their hearts out. At first, Mr. Daniels stood awkwardly at the back. But then one shy boy stumbled through a speech, voice trembling, and Shaq saw it happen. The old teacher in him woke up. Without thinking, Mr. Daniels moved closer, kneeling near the edge of the stage, clapping encouragingly until the boy found his rhythm again. The boy's eyes lit up with relief. And in that moment, Shaq saw the fire return to Mr. Daniels' eyes. The same fire he used to see when he was just a scared kid in a classroom, and this man had believed in him. On the drive home, Shaq said quietly, "You were born to do this." Mr. Daniels smiled for the first time in years. Not a polite smile. A real one. The kind that makes your whole face remember how it's supposed to feel. It wasn't finished. He wasn't healed. But the road had begun, the long, uneven road back to himself. For the first time, Mr. Daniels didn't feel like a burden or a ghost. He felt like a man walking toward the light again. And Shaq silently promised that no matter how long that road was, he would walk it beside him until the very end. Weeks rolled by, and the dream that had once seemed like fragile smoke was slowly solidifying into something real. What had started as late-night scribbles on a balcony had become blueprints, legal documents, and signed papers. Shaq's foundation had moved mountains behind the scenes, securing a small but charming old community building on the edge of the city, right where the streets met the skyline. It wasn't fancy. The walls were cracked, the floors scuffed, and the ceiling leaked when it rained. But to Mr. Daniels, the moment he stepped inside, it felt like possibility. It smelled of dust and old paint, but he could already see it differently. In his mind, the empty rooms were filled with desks and laughing kids, the walls covered in art and hope. "This could work," he whispered, eyes darting from one corner to the next. "This will work," Shaq corrected gently. "We'll make it shine." And they did. Shaq personally called in volunteers, friends, and even a few of his fellow artists to help. The place buzzed with energy. Someone patched the roof, others painted bright colors across the peeling walls. Old furniture was sanded down, polished, and turned into reading tables. Books were donated by the truckload, and colorful murals began blooming across the hallway like flowers after rain. Through it all, Mr. Daniels worked alongside everyone, sweeping, painting, carrying boxes. The first few days he moved cautiously, as if he might be told at any moment that he didn't belong. But no one told him to stop. No one looked at him with pity. They looked at him with respect, because Shaq introduced him not as someone I'm helping, but as the man who taught me everything. That sentence alone seemed to stitch something invisible back together inside him. One afternoon, as they set up bookshelves in the main room, Shaq caught Mr. Daniels standing still in the sunlight streaming through the windows. His hands were dusty, his shirt streaked with paint, but his eyes were glowing. He looked alive, like a flame had caught inside him again and was burning steady now. "You look like you're home," Shaq said quietly. Mr. Daniels smiled, and it was the kind of smile that carried years in it. "Maybe I am." Soon the building was ready. They named it the Lighthouse because, as Mr. Daniels said, some kids don't need a map. They just need a light that shows them they're not lost. Shaq insisted they make the grand opening something unforgettable. Invitations went out to community leaders, teachers, parents, local media, and even some of Shaq's celebrity friends. He wanted everyone to see what this man, this forgotten teacher, had done. On the morning of the reveal, Mr. Daniels stood in front of the mirror in the suit they had bought weeks earlier. He adjusted his tie with trembling fingers. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He was nervous, terrified even. Part of him still whispered that he didn't deserve any of this, that people would see through him and remember only the man who had lost everything. Shaq noticed the way his hands shook. He walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not the man who lost everything," he said softly. "You're the man who gave everything. And now you're giving again." Those words steadied him more than he expected. When they arrived at the lighthouse, the street was packed. Balloons bobbed at the gates, cameras flashed, and the sound of music spilled from the open doors. Kids were running around laughing, holding colorful flyers. The building that had once been crumbling now gleamed with bright paint and freshly planted flowers at the entrance. As they stepped out of the car, applause rippled through the crowd. It grew louder and louder as people realized who Mr. Daniels was. Shaq raised a hand to quiet the noise, then guided him to the small stage set up near the front door. "Everyone," Shaq began into the microphone, "this is the man who changed my life before the world even knew my name. When I was just a lost kid scribbling lyrics in the back of his class, he looked at me and said, 'There's something here.' That sentence lit a fire in me. And today I want you to know, he's about to light that same fire in hundreds more." He turned to Mr. Daniels and handed him the microphone. For a moment, Mr. Daniels just stood there, blinking into the bright sun, his heart pounding. Then he looked at the faces, so many faces, expectant and hopeful, and something inside him clicked back into place. The old rhythm, the voice he used to carry into classrooms, rose up again like it had been waiting all along. "I used to believe I could change the world through a classroom," he began, his voice steady. And then life happened. I thought that part of me was gone forever. But it turns out it was just waiting for someone to believe in me again, the way I once believed in them. The crowd was silent. Even the children stood still, listening. This place, he said, spreading his arms, is for the kids who feel invisible. For the dreamers no one listens to. For the voices that are quiet now but will roar someday. This is for them. This is for hope. The crowd erupted in applause. And for the first time in years, Mr. Daniels didn't feel like a ghost of who he used to be. He felt like himself, alive, strong, needed. As the ribbon was cut and kids rushed through the doors laughing, Shaq stood beside him quietly. Told you, he said. You just needed someone to remind you who you are. Mr. Daniels watched the children run down the halls, the walls glowing with color, and felt something he thought he'd never feel again. Pride. Not pride in what he used to be, but in who he was becoming again. The opening of the lighthouse had been magical, but no one, not even Shaq, could have predicted what would happen next. At first, the center was just a quiet place where a handful of children came after school. They colored in the art room, did their homework in the reading corner, and listened as Mr. Daniels read stories with his warm, deep voice. He moved gently among them like someone handling precious glass. Many of the kids had never had anyone listen to them before. They were used to being told to sit down, be quiet, stop dreaming. But Mr. Daniels didn't tell them to stop. He told them to speak. And they did. A girl named Maya, who never spoke above a whisper, began writing poems about the stars. A boy named Rico, who used to get in trouble for drawing on his school desk, was suddenly painting murals on the walls of the lighthouse. A shy little boy named Ellis, who hid behind his hoodie, stood up during story time and read aloud in front of everyone for the first time. Mr. Daniels cheered for each one like they had just won a gold medal. Shaq came often, slipping in quietly in the evenings, sitting at the back just to watch. Sometimes he'd help serve snacks. Sometimes he'd just sit cross-legged on the carpet while the kids talked about their dreams. He watched Mr. Daniels glow like a lamp, lighting each of them one by one. It made something warm spread through his chest every time. Soon, word spread beyond the neighborhood. Teachers started referring struggling students to the lighthouse. Parents began calling, asking how to get their kids involved. Local media did a small feature and then a big one followed. Donations poured in. Volunteers lined up. And still, Mr. Daniels remained humble, sweeping the floors at night, stacking chairs after everyone left, humming quietly like he used to when grading papers late into the evening back in the old days. But what touched Shaq the most wasn't the fame or the donations. It was seeing how the lighthouse had begun to change the whole neighborhood. The streets outside were safer now because kids had somewhere to go. Teenagers who once hung around in boredom now stayed late at the lighthouse to mentor the younger ones. Parents who barely spoke to each other before now shared coffee together at the entrance while waiting for their kids. Even the corner store owner who once complained about the noise, now kept a jar on the counter collecting spare change for the lighthouse kids. And the change reached further than anyone expected. One evening after the kids had gone home and the rooms were quiet, Shaq found Mr. Daniels sitting alone at a desk, staring at an old photo. It was of him decades ago standing in front of his first class. Remember them all? Shaq asked softly, pulling up a chair. Every single one, Mr. Daniels replied, eyes glistening. I thought I lost them. I thought I lost me. Shaq leaned back. Looks like you found more than just yourself. You're building an army of dreamers. Mr. Daniels laughed gently. And it all started because one boy saw his old teacher on the street and decided not to walk away. That sentence stayed with Shaq for days. Because it was true. It made him realize how powerful a single act of kindness could be, how one moment could ripple out and touch lives you might never even meet. Within months, something extraordinary happened. Other cities started reaching out. Community leaders from faraway neighborhoods wanted to open their own lighthouses. They wrote letters asking if Mr. Daniels could visit, speak, share his blueprint. At first he hesitated. He worried he wasn't strong enough, that leaving his center would make it crumble. But Shaq smiled and said, "You lit this fire. It won't go out just because you walk out the door. It will follow you, and light others too." So he went. And everywhere he spoke, people listened. They didn't just hear a teacher who had been homeless. They heard a man who had fallen into darkness and decided not to stay there. They heard hope. Real hope. The kind that isn't loud but steady, like a heartbeat. Soon, news stations were running stories titled, "The Teacher Who Came Back," and "From Streets to Saving Streets." Kids across the country started sending handwritten letters saying things like, "You make me want to believe in myself," and "I want to be a lighthouse too." Mr. Daniels kept each letter in a box on his desk. Some nights, when the center was quiet and everyone had gone home, he would take the letters out and read them slowly, one by one. And he would smile, not the broken smile of someone who had survived, but the radiant smile of someone who had begun again. The ripples kept spreading. One afternoon, a familiar face walked into the lighthouse. It was Jordan, one of Mr. Daniels' former students from decades ago, the boy who had always struggled to read. Now he was a grown man with a little daughter holding his hand. "You don't remember me?" Jordan said shyly. Mr. Daniels looked closer, and then his mouth opened in wonder. "Jordan?" Jordan nodded. I had to bring her here. I wanted her to meet the teacher who never gave up on me." And just like that, the circle closed. Mr. Daniels crouched down and smiled at the little girl. "Your dad," he said softly, "was one of the bravest kids I ever knew." She grinned and he felt tears sting his eyes. That night, Shaq watched from the doorway as Mr. Daniels locked up the center. The streetlights glowed like distant stars. The building behind him hummed with quiet life, even in the dark. Shaq thought about how strange and beautiful it all was. How one broken man had become a beacon. How one act of compassion had become a movement. How one ripple had turned into a wave. And he knew this was only the beginning.